There we go.
Progress.
All right. So thank you all for coming today, and thank you everybody that's on Zoom. I'm just going to give Neil a little introduction, and then he will do his presentation. And if anyone has any questions, I would just ask that you hold them till the end. And so Neil Benvie grew up in Eastern Scotland, where his parents were berry farmers. However, his first love has always been the natural world and image making. Benvie has been at the center of several of the largest outdoor photography initiatives of the last 15 years, including Wild Wonders of Europe, Meet Your Neighbors, which is what we're going to be talking about today, and 2020 Vision. He was a founding fellow of the International League of Conservation Photographers and has published 7 books and hundreds of articles. He now lives in central France, where he is Zooming with us today. And he lives in central France with his wife, Charlotte, with whom he runs food and photography retreats and claims turtle doves, nightingales, and golden orioles as his neighbors. And so he's going to talk to us today about the Meet Your Neighbors project, which is actually right over there on that wall. Okay, please take it away. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that, Rachel. That was such a good introduction. I could have written it myself.
Yeah.
Sorry, right, okay. Well, thanks for coming along, both in person and online. I understand this is going to be recorded for better or worse, so it's going to be available afterwards. So if you want to share it with anybody else who might be interested in the ideas I'll talk about, I'd be very glad, and I think I'm right in saying the institute would be as well for this to be shared. So maybe it's best if I just get straight into some pictures and share the screen. Okay, so okay that, and you should now see the picture of the newt full screen. Right, so where do we start with all this? Gosh, well, there's going to be a little bit of a preamble first with just this one image, but don't worry, it's not going to be one of these slideshows where each picture's up for 5 minutes and you just wish they would move on. But just to give you a little preamble first, this all started, I think for me, round about 1997. And I saw a photograph in a British photography magazine of some hellebores, some flowers, shot in this white background, but with a light behind them as well. And I was totally transfixed by this picture. I thought, that is just something I've been wanting to do. This just works for me. So I started working out, still in film days, of course, how to make these sorts of pictures, and didn't really get very far because as a parsimonious Scot, the prospect of wasting all this film and not getting things quite right was just a little bit too much to bear. Anyway, digital came along a few years later and I revisited the idea, and pretty much straight away with being digital, it was possible to get the results I was looking for. And I just essentially fell in love initially with the photographic technique. And I did this for 6 months or a year. This was in 2007. And after a short while, I thought, well, this is great. And I'm getting all these pictures together at that stage, principally plants. But what's it all about? What's it actually leading to? They were pictures with a context, essentially. I began to publish in some British magazines then how to make these pictures, really as a way of kind of associating my name with this particular look, although as we'll see, there were clear antecedents to me. And not, well, I think in early 2009, a photographer and designer from North Carolina called Clay Bolt got in touch with me, and I'm always pretty open to collaborating with people who I think I don't know them from Adam, but from what he said, this guy or this woman sounds like we're in the same wavelength. Let's speak to them at least and see what we can do. And that was really the genesis of the Meet Your Neighbours project, but we'll come on to that a little bit later on. Anyway, Clay Bolt at that time was trying to establish himself as a nature photographer alongside his design work, and I kind of appreciated that this was a chap who had a bunch of skills that I didn't have, and it'd be really worthwhile collaborating in some sort of project. And I still have an email from Clay at that time, from I think it was July 2009, where he was talking about, is there some sort of project we can maybe do with these, possibly around rare species? And I said, well, I'm not sure. People like Jim Baylog have done endangered species already. And I'd seen some work from Susan Middleton and David Lichwager, which also had a certain rare species focus. And I thought, no, let's make this about common species that people can actually go and meet. And Clay was totally on board with that, which was great. And it's slightly ironic that I'm showing you this particular picture, which features the Wallace's bee, which is one of the rarest or least known insects in the world. Originally, it was discovered in 1859 by Alfred Wallace, one of the early writers on evolution, in the north, one of the islands in the North Moluccas chain in Indonesia. Well, it hadn't been seen, I think, since 1981, when Clay joined an expedition in search of this bee, and lo and behold, they found it. And this is it beside a European honeybee, just to give you an idea of its scale. It has a 6 centimeter wingspan. The body is about 4 centimeters long, so it's a big, big insect. And this was the first time it had been seen for many years, and actually the first time it had ever been photographed well. And using the Meet Your Neighbours technique, as we call this, the shooting in the white background, he was able to produce a series of very, very detailed images of this insect for the first time. That's just one of the many applications that there have been over the years. Quite a few biologists, field biologists, have used it for recording species in the tropics because it's very simple, very clear images that show the subject in lots of detail. So let's look initially at the principles behind Meet Your Neighbours, and especially behind these, we call it the field studio look. So these are pictures which are taken against a pure white background, and crucially they are backlit as well as a little bit of light from the front. And it's this backlighting, they flash behind the translucent, or it lets light through the translucent white background. It's this which gives the depth to the pictures, which conventional white background pictures shot against a piece of white card don't do, because they're only lit from the side or from the front. So immediately we're getting something which has a little bit of glow, a little bit of depth to it that you don't normally get with these sorts of pictures. So the way it works, and I'll show you the various setups we've used to do this, is a piece of perspex normally, or a softbox, goes in some distance behind the white background. We determine the exposure for the background first to make sure it's as I say, blown out, that it's pure white, and then we put just enough light on the front of the subject so that we can see all the detail of it. Now, what's the point of all this palaver? Well, it essentially makes the process of creating composite images, and shortly I'll explain the benefits of that, it makes this process ever so much more straightforward than if the background is a little bit grey or is dark in the corners. This gives us the element to put into a composite image. Now, there's a few benefits to this. Firstly, if you just want to drop it on a white page, it's very simple. There's no cutting out around the fine details of the subject to do it. But I would say one of the main benefits of this approach, of this taking the subject out of context, is it shows it as an individual. It's not part of a biological community that's half hiding behind the grass and all the other vegetation. No, it's just this animal, its form, and perhaps even its character becomes a bit more evident when we photograph it this way. This is not, in some senses, nature photography, but it is a very, very particular form of illustration. And illustration, as we know from Roger Tory Peterson's work, has a very particular value in its own right. Now, we are far from the first to do this. Back in the 1920s, a German photographer called Karl Blossfeld was producing, he produced, I think, two books where he recognized that the form of his subjects was itself of aesthetic interest, and he made images of all sorts of natural subjects against a plain background, so that the focus of the viewer was entirely on the subject itself, and poppy heads too. Now, a bit later on, scrolling forward to the 1980s, David Lichtwager and Susan Middleton were two young photographers who worked as assistants to the famous portrait photographer Richard Avedon in New York. The picture on the right here was one that Avedon took in Sicily in 1948, and this was absolutely formative to the development of his own style, where famously he made his portraits of models and sitters against a plain white background. And he realized with this photograph of the boy in Sicily, that the white background has some very powerful emotional effect on the viewer. Just the sheer simplicity and the focus on the subject, he realized was a very valuable technique. And when Susan and David were working with him, they were actually more interested in animal photography, and they began to wonder if the same principle that was working so well in this man's portrait photography would also work with animals and plants. And sure enough, it did. Now, David and Susan I had corresponded with Susan for a wee while. Just when we were starting up the project, I really wanted to acknowledge its antecedents so that it wasn't just something else new in the block. It was a kind of a progression from what had been done before. And they worked together for many years, but after a while, David went off and did his own stuff, including his 1 cubic foot project. This is really worth looking at and getting the book if you can. And what he essentially did was he created a metal frame, which is metal rods, that encompassed 1 cubic foot of space. And then he placed this in various places around the world, from the Fynbos in South Africa to the ocean under the Golden Gate of San Francisco, a tree in the rainforest of Costa Rica, various places. And during a period of time, he recorded all the animals that went through that particular space. And boy, I think the the thing was that it was astonishing just how intensely rich some of these places were in terms of their biodiversity. And really, I think this is one of the key benefits of this particular photographic technique, that it allows the photographer to show the viewer in an illustration the biodiversity that is present at a particular place. And when I've been a photographer for over 30 years now, and the days when magazines still came to you asking for work, they very often requested pictures that showed biodiversity. And boy, it was really, really hard with conventional photography to do this. With this technique, it's an entirely different prospect, where you can very easily show what is present in a particular space. Excuse me. Now, you might be looking at this, and you'll certainly be looking at mine later and thinking, just hold on a minute here. Yes, all these animals are present here, but there's no sense of scale whatsoever. We know that that particular copepod is much, much smaller than that particular fish. Well, from my perspective, I am actually more interested in illustrating the communities, the animals that live together in a particular space or a time of year than I am about recording the relative size of each other. And this is the compromise that we make when we make these pictures, that they're not to scale, but they're allowing you to do something that conventional photography can't do, which is to illustrate the biodiversity of particular communities in a single page. And when you do it like David has done here, wow, I think it's pretty impressive when the message that goes with it is this is all in 1 cubic foot. Now, for my part, my composites are somewhat less ambitious, shall we say, and sometimes they're for a slightly different purpose. I produced this one for a local seed grower here in the Morvan in France, who grows wildflower seeds commercially to sell to people who want to rewild particular areas. So my concern here was really with making sure these are all species she could supply, but also which were native within our particular little region of France. The spotted fritillary butterfly could probably be regarded as decoration rather than anything particularly relevant to this project, but it just adds a little contrasting note. Quite a number of years ago, I did a project as a participant of the Wild Wonders of Europe. And this involved, I think there were 55 European nature photographers traveling all around Europe to countries other than our own to kind of bring a fresh perspective, a fresh set of eyes to what was special about the nature in that particular region. And one of my assignments was to the southeast of France, to the region of the Keras National Park. And although my principal focus was on Europe's only indigenous silk moth, I also was very interested in photographing the orchids that were there too, in particular the indigenous lady's slipper, Cypripedium calceolus, so these very showy orchids in this shot here. But of course, the orchids didn't live in isolation. They lived with other interesting calcicle plants that lived on lime. So I made a number of pictures that illustrated the community that they lived in. This was from another assignment to the alpine meadows of Austria. And when I was making the composite, I thought, well, I like these. I like the look. It's all very nice and elegant, and things are balanced together, but they're lacking depth. There's a certain amount of depth in the individual flowers, but I want to create more depth too. So all I've done here is I have a few layers. So these are Photoshop images, or I now use Affinity Publisher, but the image exists in a variety of layers, and each individual element occupies its own layer. So it's quite feasible to have some layers which are made black and white, and the opacity of which, the denseness of which is made much, much thinner. And this gives the impression of it being more in the background and out of sight. I'm slightly embarrassed to tell you the inspiration for this, but it was actually it was actually a set of table mats we had at home, and I looked at the painting and thought, oh, that's quite an interesting concept. How some things are not in color and are a lot fainter. But I then applied that principle to these illustrations of these plants. Now, something else I should maybe say at this point is that when I make these illustrations, my first concern is, do all these animals and plants occur together in that same ecosystem? I'm not going to put together things that you get in sand dunes beside the sea with things that grow in our meadows 5 hours away from the sea here. That's biologically, it's just not accurate. I do, though, want to make an image which is aesthetically pleasing. Why? Well, because nowadays, the biggest challenge that any photographer has, and if any of you folks are photographers, you'll know this already, the biggest challenge we have is getting people to look at our photographs for more than 2 seconds. In this Instagram generation and this Instagram age, flick, flick, scroll, and getting somebody to stop and look carefully is really, really hard. So it's one of the reasons I make these pictures, which are in some ways quite complex compositions. There's lots of stuff to look at in them, even as far down as the things in the background. So the pictures, I think, and I hope, are a little bit more arresting than a lot of conventional photographs. Now you might think, well, look, just hold on. You call yourself a nature photographer, Neil, but I don't care whether you've photographed all these things out in nature, which I have, rather than in a studio. It's a field studio, but you just don't see this in nature, all these things together. I mean, some of these plants are flowering much earlier than other ones. And you're absolutely right. But I would argue that pictures like this have a value in their own right as illustrations because they're showing biodiversity, they're showing the stuff that exists in the space, which is frankly impossible to do with conventional photography. Moreover, I think too that you're not fooling anybody with an image like this. People see it, they see the white background, and immediately they think, oh, that's been taken in a studio. Their expectations are adjusted immediately, and rather than thinking, God, wasn't he lucky finding that? They're thinking, okay, it's an illustration. What am I looking at in this illustration? So I think there's no risk that we're fooling our viewers, but we're also, with this technique, able to deliver something which conventional photography can't have. Now, I'm very happy to enter into a discussion about this afterwards if you have strongly opposing views, but that's my justification for making these sorts of pictures. I'd also argue that they are aesthetically, if they're done well, I think they're quite engaging too, and they get people to look at what are quite often very common species rather than the rarities. And this is one of the things that underpinned the ethos of the Meet Your Neighbours project, that it was about getting people to look at what was round about them, not what was inaccessible or in a remote country, but present it to them in a way which they'd maybe not seen it before, with a degree of detail which they maybe hadn't seen it in. And because these pictures are each made generally about f16, so there's a lot of everything is in focus in the picture, and there's not lots of confusing vegetation round about. People can actually really see what the subjects look like, and never more so than with the insects. So let's look briefly at how we do this. So we have here a Seraphis orchid in Spain, northern Spain. I took this with a white background in behind it, with one flash behind that background, and then another flash shining through a translucent piece of material to the left, which provides the front lighting on it. Now, we haven't actually cut the orchid, obviously, and we haven't trimmed any vegetation. I've just used a couple of pieces of plastic to hold down the vegetation round about the plant so we can see it clearly. One of the nice things about the technique, I think, is that it's actually pretty accessible. You don't need a lot of expensive equipment to do it. You can do it with expensive equipment, but all you basically need is two second-hand old manual flash guns that you can adjust the power on. They don't need to be smart strobes or anything like that. You need a way of triggering that flash remotely from the camera. So that could simply be quite a cheap infrared trigger that goes on top of the camera, and when it fires, it activates a little slave unit underneath the other flash. So you have no cables, so you can put the flash where you need it, and you have two of these flash guns. Now, I've been on eBay, and you can buy these for, well, $50 to $100. It doesn't need to be anything fancy at all, so long as you can trigger it remotely and you can adjust the flash power manually. The background, a piece of plexiglass, round about 40% transmission of the light is perfect. That you'll get inexpensively, I would imagine, a piece maybe 18 inches by 12 inches. That'll do for a lot of flowers. You probably buy that for $10 or $15 at most. And for the front light, to soften the light coming onto the subject, you can probably buy something similar to that. I use actually, it's well, I think the name in Australia, I don't know about the States, is Core Light. It's a corrugated, opaque plastics with a layer of plastic on the outside, so it sandwiches a little sort of corrugated layer. Anyway, the point is that it is used actually for packing. I've used to use it for packing transparencies to the post in the past, and it's very inexpensive, very lightweight to carry. But boy, the quality of light you get with it is absolutely beautiful. Why? Because it takes your little speed light flash head, which is just like about 4 inches by 1 inch, and it creates, when you fire the light through that, a much bigger light source. And a bigger light source means softer, more gentle shadows and much more sympathetic lighting on the subject. And what I've done here in this little illustration is just how we go about getting the light for the final subject, if you're interested. I have done an ebook that's on our site that goes into excruciating detail about everything about this technique if you're interested. Anyway, so here we have in picture one, the subject is in shadow because there's only one light firing at this stage from behind the piece of plexiglass, which itself is behind the subject. And we adjust that, the power of that flash gun, so that the background is completely blown out. In other words, as you look at the back of your camera, it's blinking away. If you have your highlights warning on, it will say background's blown out, but that's what we want for this. We want pure white. So in the second picture, what we're needing to do is find out how much light do we need for the front of the subject. So we turn off the background flash, and that's why the background is grey now. And we put on our front flash and we adjust its power so that the subject looks quite nicely lit. But do you see in the first picture, the subject is more or less a silhouette. And as I said before, we kind of want to show the translucent qualities of the subject. So what we then do is we don't adjust the exposure for the background, but we do move that background a bit closer to the subject. And now in the third picture, we switched off the front flash again. We put on the back one, and you can see the distance it is at from the subject. The light is beginning to shine through the subject. It's not blowing it out. And this is amazing. It's a white flower, but we're still seeing detail in it. So that we've now got our correct exposure for the background, but because we moved it closer, we're getting a bit of light coming through the subject. And now we can switch our front light on as well, put a little pop of light through it, and it's no longer as dark as in 3, and we've got a perfect balance between light for the subject and the background. And that's what we're wanting to achieve. And as I say, I just use the snowdrop as an example because who would have thought you could photograph a white flower against a white background? Well, you can by managing the distance between the flower and the background. Right, so of course, there's lots of different subjects we're photographing with this. This old guy with the beard used to be me, I think. And here I'm using a different sort of set. Remember with the flowers, we had to manage the distance between the background and the subject so we got the balance of light correct, just enough light coming onto the subject. And that happens as well when you photograph insects. If you put the insect, in this case a field cricket, directly in your white background, all that's going to happen is that lots of light will come gushing around the sides of it. So you need to manage the distance between the background and where your subject is. So what we've done here is, if you have a look, there's 2 flash guns attached to this tripod. Now one of them is pointing down at a piece of white plexiglass, and that is creating my white background behind the subject, which is sitting in this little, you can't see it's a curved set, but it's sitting in this curved transparent set. And the fact it's transparent means that I'm now able to manage the distance between the background and the subject without getting horrible ghosting. So if I don't do that, what happens? Well, here's an example where I've done it wrongly on the left and correctly on the right. So on the left, the subject was sitting in a white background. So the flash was coming through, it was making the background pure white, but in the process, the subject was getting a little bit burned out on its underside, and it just looked a little bit hot. And it's more particularly clear when we have a look at these pebbles, which have sat directly in a white background, and you've got all this horrible ghosting around the edges of the stone. In contrast, on the right, we sat the subject in a curved, transparent background, manage the distance, and we have a much cleaner look to the animal. And the same with these pebbles as well. Anyway, this is all boring and technical, but I just thought I would give you a little bit of background, just so you can see that it's nothing. It's not rocket science, it's a methodical set of steps that you take in order to execute these pictures. I would say the only art in it comes when we start to assemble the composites. Now, one of the nice things I liked about the Meet Your Neighbours project was once we got going, we published the protocol. I did it pretty much in the first year after I worked it all out, so that I could have my name associated with it, which was fine. But as we know, there are other people done it before. But the great thing was that when we came to start the Meet Your Neighbours project, we had it all ready made to pass on to all the other photographers so they could do the pictures technically exactly the same way. The beauty of this then was we were able to assemble a collection which, no matter where they came from in the world, all looked technically exactly the same. And therefore, the focus was not on, oh, isn't that photographer particularly good, better than that one? No, it was just all about the subjects because they're all taken exactly the same way. And that, for me, was actually quite an appealing thing, putting photographers' egos in the box, because photographers can be awful people sometimes, they have awful egos. But here, it's all about the subject, which is great. And as I said before too, I think one of the things I really, really love about the Meet Your Neighbours look, the Feel Studio look, is it casts our subjects as individuals. So here's two animals which would probably people wouldn't give a second glance at. But when you see, in this case on the left, a European minnow in full breeding garb, and on the right, a palmate newt, which looks rather sad, I think. We're not seeing these as species anymore, but as actual individuals. And that's something quite unusual in nature photography. It's also kind of at the root of what my whole, well, the thing that I really, really am enchanted by as a nature photographer. And it's the thought that every living thing that exists today has an unbroken lineage of zygotes all the way back to the very, very earliest forms of life. That's kind of staggering if you think about it. We all know about evolution, and we can sort of imagine maybe even ourselves evolved back to much simpler primates. But even that is quite amazing that, at every stage, an individual has managed to reproduce, and their young have lived long enough to produce another generation. And that has been repeated and repeated and repeated millions of times. And it's kind of, for me, the miracle of life that any of us, the individuals that we are actually here at all. Because at any time in that evolutionary history, back to the very, very earliest life forms, our line could have been snuffed out, as the huge majority have been. And yet we've kind of won the lottery millions of times, and it's just wow. Anyway, that's just a little philosophical aside as to why I think it's really valuable and important to show animals as individuals rather than just the member of a species. Technically, again, this I'm not going to linger long in this because it's a bit boring for non-photographers. But if you are interested in doing this, there is an incredibly valuable little setting in Photoshop which allows you to create these composite images very easily. You'll understand, of course, that although the images have white backgrounds, they are basically, as far as Photoshop's concerned, solid white backgrounds. So if you try to put one Photoshop image layer on top of another one, all that's going to happen is it will hide the one that's underneath. If you go to your layers panel and at the top of them there's something called blending modes, and if you change it from normal to darker color, lo and behold, whatever color is darker in a set of layers is the one that gives way. So here, sorry, that takes precedence. So here we have this arrowhead plant. The white background of it gives way to whatever is darker color blending mode underneath it. And therefore, the point is it becomes very, very much easier to create these seamless composites. So all the details are in this book, which Rachel might or might not share at the end of it all. Anyway, so going on from this idea, sorry, yeah, of individuality, I began to think, there's probably lots and lots of different things I could be doing this with. So one of my first projects, once I hit onto this, was photographing 500 beech leaves and then 500 oak leaves, each one individually in the autumn. So I create I have basically a production line where I've got the flash and the soft boxes and the table all set up, and the camera and the stand, and I just introduce a subject, blam, next one, blam, and there's no art in it, but the fun is when you then start to create these composite images and you realize that, oh, actually, this bunch of leaves on the forest floor are all a little bit different from each other. And just as a little counterpoint to it, I would always put in an animal that you would find in that particular habitat. Here we have a stag beetle, European stag beetle. I think you've got something similar in the United States, but it's just, again, I'm a little bit fixated on this notion of individuality and the specificity of things. And that even extends to pebbles. You know, where we used to live in Scotland, there's a beach, this is on the east coast of Scotland, there was a beach that was backed by some sandstone cliffs. And these were composed of conglomerate, of what we call pudding stone. Now, once I started to look into the history of this, and this was a beach I'd gone to ever since I was a very, very small child. I had always been fascinated by these pebbles. But these were, in Devonian times, already very, very ancient stones that had been worked smooth in rivers. And in that time, in Devonian times, when incidentally Scotland was, or the piece of land that became Scotland, was more much, much closer to the equator than it is today, these river smoothed pebbles became embedded in what became the lower Old Red Sandstones that over eons drifted further north to where Scotland is today. And then over an unbelievably long period of time, these cliffs, which were the accumulation of the sandstone and the pebbles, these cliffs began to erode. And over an even longer time, these pebbles all ended up on the beach that I have visited all my life. And for me, the absolutely intriguing thing about this was that these are objects which were, I forget just how long ago the Devonian is. I think it might be about 300 million years. But these are still, to this day, very beautiful objects, which, as you walk along the beach, look nothing until the tide sweeps in, the water recedes, and you see them sitting there, and they're just so beautiful. So each one of these pebbles was made just a little bit damp, not too shiny, but a little bit damp rubbing the water into the surface of it, photographed, and then put back in the beach again. And why? Well, it's just because it's the sort of thing that people don't notice. It's under their feet, it's grey unless it's wet, but boy, they don't know what they're missing unless they start looking at things more closely. And I think I collected 500 of these pebbles to photograph for this project. Initially, with the Meet Your Neighbours project, the focus was very much on photographing subjects which were their absolute peak, which just were perfection. But then one day, an Australian contributor to the project called Lily Kump, well, she had actually American, but she lived and worked in Australia. She posted simple composite image of a dozen eucalyptus leaves in various stages of decay. And this was something quite novel. And I thought, oh, I absolutely adore this. So I then went off and found a lot of rhododendron leaves in this case and did a similar thing. But the point is that, and it took me a long, long time to learn this lesson, but one of the really nice things about the Meet Your Neighbours project was it was a collaborative one where we not only shared the technique, but we shared ideas, fresh ideas as well. I showed people initially how you do it, but then other people, possibly a bit smarter than me, went off and did something with it that I hadn't thought of before. And this, for me, was a real lesson in the benefits of sharing creative ideas, not trying to keep it all to yourself and try and say, oh, this is my idea alone. Nowadays with the internet, this just doesn't happen. It's a lot of nonsense. So this is why I'm always very keen when I have a new idea to put it out there quite quickly, to share it, to let people know how it's done, so they can evolve it, and then I can reappropriate it, do something different with it, and it's a creative snowball effect. And for me, this was one of the great benefits of the Meet Your Neighbours project. There's a certain element, as I said earlier, the creative part, I think, comes when you start to assemble the composite images. And during COVID, I think we all probably had more time in their hands than we particularly wanted to have. But I was fortunate that I could still legally access a riverbank in Woodland, not too far from home, on my bike, and I made so much work at that time, and really worked in developing the whole technique then. So these were wild chives, along with a plant called keeled garlic, which has got these beautiful long. I'm not sure what the term is for these, but these papery bits that dangle down are very elegant. These are what we in Europe we class as cornfield weeds. So we have the blue cornflowers, common poppies. We've got fumintry and sand spurry and barley and yeah, so a whole bunch of stuff. Why? Well, because I'm wanting to illustrate diversity and communities of plants that you get growing together. Now, they're not all to scale, but as I say, my principal concern is reflecting the harmony that exists within these natural communities between the subjects in how I photograph them, rather than providing a sort of scientific record of scale. Sometimes I would just do one or two species. These are, I don't know if you have anything equivalent in the States. I don't think you do, but these are fritillaries that grow wild in damp meadows in a few parts of Europe. Are kind of uncommon now because of these meadows have largely been ploughed up and drained. And then a very beautiful Pulsatilla vulgaris. Now, there's a couple of things have changed here from some of the earlier pictures that you saw. One is I began to find the white background of the final composite image just a bit stark, quite hard to look at. So I then began to put in a very subtle, slightly cream background. It just took the intensity, the glare off the images. I also was very much attracted to old illustrations, well, initially by Gould, John Gould, an English artist. There's a story about him. I come to in a minute, but also John James Audubon, of course. And this sort of 19th century tradition of natural history illustration, which I was really very attracted to. My father, although he was a farmer, he was at heart a nature man. He was very, very keen on birds. He actually bred Australian parakeets and finches on a commercial basis, as well as being interested in wild ones, and exported these all over Europe. But he instilled in me a profound interest in the natural world, particularly in birds, which has been a kind of a gift for life, actually. But anyway, one he had a lot of bird paintings around the house. There were those by the Edwardian English artist Archibald Thorburn, but he also had some old Gould lithographs as well. Now, John Gould was a very, very commercially very successful publisher, and we assume when we see one of the pictures from his stable that it's that he painted them, but he didn't. His wife was the artist, he was the publisher, and poor woman, she's very much been subjugated. And people always think he was a painter, but no, there was a stable of a number of painters whose work he published, but the work that we put down as John Gould's was actually his wife's. The other interesting thing I learned when I was digging into all this was the story about John James Audubon's illustrations. Um, I used to see some pictures, particularly of the American flamingos and some of the herons. I thought that is such a weird pose that bird is pulling there. Now, I'm sorry if I'm telling you stuff you know already here, but as a European, this is quite interesting to learn. Well, apparently he worked with a paper size called elephant, which is pretty big, but it does have its limitations. And because he was working with well, sorry, with dead specimens, they had to kind of fit the paper that he was working with. So it goes, story goes, and that's why if you compare the size of elephant-sized paper with some of his paintings, like of the flamingos or the herons, that's why they're just a little bit smaller, and the necks had to be brought round. Now, I'm very happy to be corrected. This is what I read, and it's entirely plausible. But if this is some sort of urban myth, please do correct me on it, because I wouldn't like to propagate it further. So anyway, going down the illustration route, this was the kind of the next iteration of the work, where I was trying to make a fairly elegant composition with members of the same species. But what I've been interested in for quite a few years is drawing the colors out. I started doing this initially with landscapes, where I would have a set of 27 tiles beside the subject, where I'd drawn sampled colors, like color transects from within the picture, and presented these separately. Why? Because I think that it's very difficult for people to see colors clearly in an image unless they're presented separately from it, but alongside. And again, it was another device to keep the people with the image for longer. They couldn't help, I found, looking at the color tiles and trying to figure out where in the picture did that particular one come from. Anyway, all I've done here is a similar idea, but presenting the key colors from the subject as separate watercolor swatches. I have to say that these are actually done with Photoshop. I spent a long time inventing a brush in Photoshop that would reproduce the look of a watercolor sample there. And I also chose a font. This is actually taken from, well, the font in the bottom left is taken from a 19th century American document, and it's called Lamar pen. I don't know any more about it than that, but that was the detail I got when I bought it. And the one at the top is called Campbell. And this is, funnily enough, this is a font that is used a lot in old illustrations, I've discovered, but also on French wine bottles too. So it's quite a useful multi-purpose one. So we did it with just with plants, with insects. This orange tip butterfly was sitting on the top of the it's we in British in English we call it the Jack by the hedge or garlic mustard, and it was quite a nice composition. And gladioli, yeah. So I've kind of experimented a bit further with this, going for a more clearly retro look where the colours are not modern and strong, they're slightly faded out as well with this arum. And then I've done quite a number of these, well, I call them species panels, where again we have a variety of species present together in the same habitat, maybe not at the same time, but found together in these places. And yeah, but again with a decidedly retro look. Right, just before I go on to some of the bird pictures I've done, and boy, it's hard work. This is a setup I used to do it. So this is it's a few years ago, so a bit grimmer than it is now. But essentially, if you can imagine that our kitchen is out of shot to the left, round about 5 yards from where the feeders are, the light we see in the foreground on the left is firing through the sheet of, I call it flyweight, core light. It's a fluted plastic material that basically scatters a light and gives a very beautiful light quality to the front of the picture. And then in behind, you can maybe just see there's another flash gun in behind that big sheet of plexiglass that is providing the back lighting for the picture. And this is the basically the setting where I've done a number of bird photographs. So here we have the Parus major, the great tit, European species, very like a chickadee, that same sort of family. Not the same genus, I don't think, but certainly same family. Yeah, so we're just creating composites where the animal is clearly the focus of the picture, but with supporting elements as well found in these places. The blue tit. I think when I took this one, as you know, with chickadees, they're so fast. They just don't hang about at all at feeding stations. But I think with this one, which seems to be striking a very histrionic pose, I think there was a buzzard going overhead at the time, and it just froze and kept its eye upwards to make sure there was not going to, not that a buzzard would take one of these, but it was a bird of prey, and that was frightening enough as it was. And then the sadly rather rare now tree sparrow, as opposed to the Passer domesticus, the house sparrow, which has tree sparrows have declined about 90% in Britain at least. It was a classic farmland bird for many years, but like so many others, it's not done well under modern farming regimes. And we've got nuthatch. So this stick was just set up beside the feeder, and down came this Eurasian nuthatch. I felt obliged to put these pictures in at the end because I hope not dishonestly, I've shown you more pictures of birds and of plants and insects than I have of actual birds. But I'm sure you're all very open-minded and see the potential of the technique to do some interesting things with it as well. Yeah. So the guy on the right here, the Hawfinch, I guess this is closest to your grosbeaks, but they're pretty uncommon in Britain. They're somewhat more common in continental Europe, but I'd only ever once seen one as a child at the top of a tree very distantly, and I was so excited when these guys started coming into the garden. They're a bit bossy. They're a lot bigger than the other finches. We've got Eurasian goldfinches and chaffinches as well. And I always think the other birds that just don't really want to point out what a ridiculous sized head it's got. Um, they famously can crack cherry stones, and they always look very severe, very cross. And the other birds just keep their distance from them, but they're quite a find. And we have them coming into our garden not every day in the winter, but quite often, particularly earlier in the season as well. And they don't feed on cherry stones here; they feed on black sunflower seeds. So I think that pretty much concludes. That's a Eurasian goldfinch. What I've got to say, I've left, I think, plenty of time to take any questions that you might have, technical or philosophical. But if you want to go and get on to your date, that's fine. But I say I'm very open to questions now, and I'll stop sharing the screen at this point. If you can find where the cursor is. That's the only problem with this. I can't